I hope that you all can appreciate how difficult it was for us to narrow the field of essay contributors for this panel. And I think that we picked 4 amazing participants, and thank you all for all the words that you shared with us today. We will now open the floor for questions. Please raise your hand and I will be calling on people. State your name if you so choose, and to which panelist you are directing your question, or if it is one for all of them to answer. Yes, please.
I'm Kev Smith, and it's to the entire panel. Was any litigation ever filed that challenged the Emancipation Proclamation, the way that we see any kind of a sort of political act now, like even Obamacare has been challenged constitutionally in the courts?
No. No, and for 2 reasons. One reason is that as a war measure, as a war powers proclamation, effectively what Lincoln has done is to invoke martial law. And, in fact, 2 days after the preliminary proclamation was issued, he does suspend habeas corpus all across the North. So, in the absence of habeas corpus, there really isn't going to be much in the way of a serious challenge until, of course, the war is over. Now, Lincoln's anxiety was that if there was going to be litigation challenging emancipation, it was going to come as soon as the war was over, because then the war powers will expire. And then the normal operation of courts everywhere will take over again. And in a sense, that's the major reason why he creates those exceptions in the proclamation. Because the areas which are zoned off from the application of the proclamation are precisely those areas where the civil courts and the civil process has now been reopened because they're occupied by federal forces. In other words, they're not at war with the United States anymore. Therefore, he can't free slaves as a war powers proclamation there. If he tries to, then that would, in fact, go straight into the civil courts, because martial law would not be operating in that environment. So there's no litigation then, and there isn't afterwards, because the 13th Amendment then renders it all moot. That's why he refers to the 13th Amendment as the king's cure for the evil, because that gets it out of the courts absolutely and completely.
Just add a couple things. I agree entirely with what Alan said. In August, certainly the summer of 1864, he meets on 2 separate occasions with Martin Delany and Frederick Douglass, 2 black political activists, very famous in their time. Lincoln doesn't think he's going to win re-election. It's the occasional blind memorandum, some of you are familiar with that. And what does he talk to them about separately? How can we spirit as many slaves across Union lines before the next president takes over? Because the first thing McClellan is going to do is rescind the Emancipation Proclamation. No more protection. No more federal protection for slaves in those areas stipulated in the deed. The second point I wanted to make, even if there wasn't any litigation, interestingly enough, Benjamin Curtis, one of the 2 dissenters in the 1857 Dred Scott case, wrote a fairly well-known pamphlet excoriating Lincoln for issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, martial law, military courts, the suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus. So it is a lively debate in the public letters, as it were, in the newspapers, in the streets. So even if there wasn't litigation actually pursued, it was certainly needless to say, a hot topic.
By the way, there are at least 2 cases we know of litigation that took place under the Emancipation Proclamation. Federal litigation against slave owners trying to keep slaves in bondage in areas that were subsequently liberated by federal forces. So people who say that the Emancipation Proclamation had no legal teeth, no, it did, and we know of at least 2 instances in which it had legal teeth in prosecuting slave owners who tried to keep slaves in bondage.